to see if you're strong enough to be a part of Miranda's family.
I don't want a new family. I don't want any family. Families suck.
The Resident Evil franchise is a video game series that's no stranger to reinvention. After pioneering and popularizing the template for survival horror with the first 3 games on PlayStation, the series began to stagnate with some less interesting spin-offs like the Outbreak games, before series creator Shinji Mikami would completely revolutionize the industry with the masterpiece Resident Evil 4. A similar thing then happened with the numerous sequels and spin-offs that followed, straying further from horror with Resident Evil 6. A game that I initially didn't like, but I've discovered a new appreciation and love for in the last few years for its bombastic action and refined combat controls.
Always something with women!
The series would then once again reinvent itself with 2017's Resident Evil 7. Taking things back to basics with a more confined setting, returning staples like inventory management and a focus on puzzle solving, Resident Evil 7 relaunched the series back into the spotlight once again. Moving into a new first-person perspective to elevate its stronger horror focus, RE7 took influences from films like The Blair Witch Project, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Evil Dead, as well as borrowing gameplay ideas from popular games of the time like Outlast, with you hiding from the stalking members of the Baker family. Despite having one of the most underwhelming final boss fights in the series, and a terrible redesign for Chris Redfield, Resident Evil 7 was a success for the franchise, which is kind of funny considering how much hate the early demos and gameplay videos received from certain fans. This then led the way to the fantastic remake of Resident Evil 2 in 2019, and then the case-in-point sequel, Resident Evil Village from last year, which has now just received a DLC called The Winter's Expansion, over a year after its release. The new expansion includes an update to the Mercenaries mode, a new story campaign featuring Rose Winters, and a brand new third-person mode. So I figured, what better time to revisit this particularly interesting entry into the franchise and see how it holds up now that a fair bit of time has passed. Also, I won't be talking about the new RE-verse multiplayer here because I played the beta and it just really wasn't my thing. Same with Resident Evil Resistance. To be honest, the closest I think the series has got to having a fun multiplayer was with 2012's Operation Raccoon City. But that may just be me because Left 4 Dead is one of my favourite games. Anyway, with that said, let's return to Resident Evil Village, shall we?
Nothing but blood and death. Huh?
Resident Evil Village picks up 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7, and returns to the story of Ethan Winters, as well as the first-person perspective after the remakes of RE2 and 3, where after everyone's favourite boulder puncher, Chris Redfield, seemingly kills his wife Mia and his daughter Rose is kidnapped, Ethan finds himself stranded in a dangerous rural village in the middle of Europe as he tries to rescue his daughter. That kind of sounds a bit like Resident Evil 4, doesn't it? Once you properly get into playing Village, things will start to feel familiar to most longtime fans of the series in a number of ways. The structure is fairly similar to Resident Evil 7, with the centre of the village acting as a sort of central hub, much like Zoe's trailer did, leading off to the different areas that are progressively unlocked throughout the campaign. Compared to 7, however, there is a much grander sense of scale to this game, as Capcom pushes the RE engine even further, which you can see from the outset of the village as the vista of Castle Dimitrescu looms in the distance. It kinda goes without saying that even a year later, this is a pretty incredible looking game with a fantastic gritty art direction, and quite a variety of locations you get to explore, all with different moods, and I like how the lighting changes over the course of the game, as a subtle way of showing progression through the story. While this game does share a fair bit of elements from Resident Evil 7 in terms of the controls and its focus on survival and puzzle solving, Village shares a lot more in common with Resident Evil 4, something the developers were pretty open about, almost to the point where Village feels like a spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4, kind of like how The Evil Within was definitely tributing it heavily too back in 2014. Playing the game with the newly added third-person mode, like I did for this playthrough, further reinforces this feeling of deja vu for Resident Evil 4, and I have to say I almost prefer the third-person perspective, given the much greater focus on action compared to RE7, and the much higher enemy count. Having that extra sense of situational awareness makes the combat feel better for the most part, but I'll go further into that a bit later. This much stronger focus on action is made very clear during its opening skirmish against a horde of Lycans, a sequence that is very similar to the iconic opening village battle against the Ganados in Resident Evil 4. There's even a shotgun just waiting for you in a house, in much the same fashion as RE4. It's quite a stark contrast to Resident Evil 7, where the most amount of enemies you'd face at once was like 2 of the molded. And the further you get into Village, the more similarities to RE4 you'll notice, with probably the most notable one being the massive castle you explore early on, only instead of it being home to a squeaky midget Napoleon, this castle instead is the lair of the internet's favourite giant mommy vampire, Lady Dimitrescu, and her daughters.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
This segment of the game is probably where the gameplay is the most similar to Resident Evil 7, as it's very exploration focused and Lady D will pursue you throughout a few areas of the castle, in much the same fashion as Jack Baker or Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. I must say though, despite having a, shall we say, appealing design, Lady D isn't actually all that threatening of a presence. I mean, don't get me wrong, she will still brutalize you if you let her catch you, but much like Mr. X, her AI isn't that great, and it's pretty easy to avoid her. Not to mention, it does feel like her area of patrol is a lot more limited when compared to Mr. X, who could pretty much stalk you throughout the entire police station. Whereas during this playthrough, I felt like I barely saw her.
To hell with the ceremony!
As I said in my last video, if they're going to incorporate another stalker enemy into the Resident Evil 4 remake, and it looks like they're probably going to given that Leon is able to crouch now, I honestly feel like they need to do something a bit more interesting than just another big thing that walks after you.
Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
During this sequence in the castle is where another mechanic from Resident Evil 4 is introduced, with the merchant known as the Duke, who will sell you various items such as bigger attaché cases, new weapons, as well as numerous upgrades for your guns like firepower, reload speed, and capacity. This also means that there are a lot more hidden collectibles throughout the game world, much like Resident Evil 4 that can be found and sold to the Duke. A new Game Plus mode encourages replayers as you get to keep your equipment and continue upgrading it, eventually amassing enough ridiculous firepower to give Leon a run for his money.
What are you buying? Just something an old friend of mine used to say.
The eventual confrontation against Lady Dimitrescu is probably one of the best set pieces in the game, as in typical Resident Evil fashion, she transforms into a gigantic monstrosity, which once again kind of highlights how vastly different in tone Village is to Resident Evil 7, as this is essentially the first real boss of the game, if you don't include her daughters, which were more like mini-bosses. It's just a bit of a shame that this section of the game is so short and so early into the story, as Lady Dimitrescu is easily one of the most interesting characters in the game, and it was kind of sad to see her go so soon.
Well, Ethan Winters, you escaped my little brother's idiot games, did you?
The next area of the village is one of the most talked about parts of the whole game after it launched, with many saying it was one of the scariest things they had played in a while, and it really does stand out as one of the highlight sequences in the game, where it goes quote-unquote full horror. Tucked away in a far corner of the map, completely isolated on the side of a mountain, is House Beneviento, and it really does feel isolated and almost completely separated from the rest of the game, as there is no music here, just the hauntingly quiet atmosphere of the house and the waterfall outside. You wander through the seemingly empty manor and finally reach an elevator which takes you down into an incredibly creepy basement area, and this is where things start to get pretty scary, as you proceed to lose all of your weapons and have to solve a number of different puzzles to try and escape. This sequence takes a few cues from the PT Silent Hills demo in its design, mainly in how it so effectively creates an increasing sense of tension and dread as you venture back and forth between these corridors, slowly uncovering new items, all the while you just know that something bad is just waiting to happen and could happen on your next venture to find a quest item. It all culminates in an encounter with one of the most horrifying creatures in the entire franchise, despite being eerily similar to the fetus from PT, that leaves you with no choice but to run and hide as its disturbing cries echo throughout the hallways. It's a terrifying scene to play, and I think the reason why it's so effective is because of how isolated this entire sequence feels from the rest of the game, as you never revisit this location again, and it makes going back to blasting lichens in the face of a shotgun feeling like a relief. Leaving behind this haunting experience in the basement almost makes it feel like a strange nightmare.
Good. I need to get out of this place.
However, it was while replaying the sequence in third person where my main issue with the new perspective began to stick out more. You see, while Village is definitely more of an action game, and the third person perspective definitely lends itself well to that part of the experience, parts of Village are still trying to be a creepy horror game that it can clash with this new perspective, as the game was designed with the first person perspective in mind. There are a number of areas that are quite tightly designed and also incredibly dark, which creates a great sense of tension and claustrophobia when playing in first person. But some of these areas I feel don't work quite as well in third person, particularly the basement sequence. With the camera now being so far behind Ethan, I felt like I couldn't see jack shit, despite most of my playthrough being played at night. Like I said, since this game was designed to be played in first person, I feel like the intended effect is sometimes lost in translation from first person to third person. Interestingly, I found this didn't really happen when I played Resident Evil 2 with a first person mod. I think because that game was designed with more player mobility in mind given its third person nature, moving into first person felt a bit more natural. I did still really enjoy playing Village in third person as I said, so it's not a deal breaker.
What am I supposed to do?
The next area of the game is essentially one giant set piece against the ugly fish lord Moreau, and it's here where Village doesn't even attempt to hide its influence from Resident Evil 4. This whole sequence is essentially the Del Lago boss fight, but on steroids, as you navigate your way across these flimsy walkways on the lake. It's a pretty fun and intense set piece, though it is kind of funny that Moreau can't just jump up on one of the houses and snatch Ethan. I guess there's no copies of Jaws for him to watch in this lonely, rural part of Europe. However, for me personally, this is kind of the last high point for the game, as I feel like the rest of the campaign just isn't quite as interesting as the first half. The Stronghold is just a bit of a mindless shootout against hordes of lichens, and the entire sequence throughout Heisenberg's factory just feels like an absolute slog, with the level design feeling really samey throughout. There's a kind of cool boss fight against this creature with a propeller for a face, but for me it's not enough to make this area feel as interesting as the castle was. Not to mention, I just really didn't like the character of Heisenberg. I found his voice really grating to listen to as he constantly taunted and whined at you over the speakers throughout the factory.
Miranda thinks we're nothing but children. Oh, she doesn't care for us? No. She's long lost all her humanity.
Jeez, does he always go on like this?
Here is also where you finally learn just what the hell Chris has been up to, and that he didn't actually kill Mia. He instead had attempted to kill the figure known as Mother Miranda, who was impersonating Mia, and just felt like being a real dick about it by not telling Ethan, which is something that even his teammates criticize him for. Chris also has a new voice actor this time around, and I'm not entirely sure that it works. He's played by the same guy that voiced Carlos in the Resident Evil 3 remake, and I'm not saying that he does a bad job here, it's just that he doesn't do anything to differentiate his voice from Carlos, so it feels kinda strange to have two completely different characters in the series who sound exactly the same.
This whole town's gone to hell. The people here, they're acting like those Ganado detailed in the Kennedy report. And aside from that, there's something new, something we've never encountered before.
Yeah, I don't know anything about all that. But you don't have to trust me, but I'm going to the shelter. I will stay down here and finish planting explosives. You take that elevator, I'll meet you topside.
You ever get the feeling you're expendable?
You then have to take on Heisenberg in an absolutely ludicrous boss fight, where you ride a ramshackle tank that Chris has somehow built, and then Ethan is seemingly killed by Mother Miranda, leading to probably the worst sequence in the game, where you have to play as Chris leading an assault on the village, where the action is ramped up to Resident Evil 6 levels. But the problem here is that Resident Evil 6 actually had really good controls that were specifically tailored towards action-driven gameplay, and managing large-scale battles felt fun due to the high mobility the player had. Whereas here, it still plays largely the same as Resident Evil 7, which is a lot slower and a bit more clunky, so fighting against massive hordes like this just isn't fun. Somehow though, the ending of the game proves to be really satisfying and almost quite touching. We learn that Ethan had in fact been infected with the mold virus right from the beginning of Resident Evil 7, which explains how he's managed to survive so many of his ridiculous injuries just by pouring first aid juice all over his hands. As his body finally starts to deteriorate, he sacrifices himself to save his daughter Rose and destroys the Megamycete controlling the mold in a very bittersweet finale. The post-credit scene was a cool surprise, showing a teenage Rose some years later that teases that she has inherited abilities from the mold and that she will be playing a key role in future sequels.
Way to keep it together, Rose.
As a whole, Resident Evil Village is a mostly enjoyable experience that attempts to combine the best parts of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4, which at times can make the game feel just a little bit messy, giving the two clashing tones and gameplay styles. It was also during the subsequent replay through the game where I noticed that it did feel like there was a number of cuts that had been made to the story throughout development. Like early on, you rescue a young woman named Elena and her father, taking shelter in a nearby house where you meet the last survivors of the village, and it feels like they're setting up Elena as a character who might play a substantial role in the story, only for her and everyone to then die literally 5 minutes later, making the whole sequence feel like nothing of any consequence just happened. Apparently the actress who played Elena was surprised at how reduced her appearance was in the final game. It's also really weird that Chris shows up with a team of absolute nobodies that get zero development, but not his partner Jill Valentine? I mean, this could have been a really good opportunity to bring Jill back into the core storyline of the series. There's also concept art that reveals that Ada Wong was originally meant to play some role in the story, but was cut out because obviously now we have the remake of Resident Evil 4 just around the corner, which kind of makes Resident Evil Village feel like a bit of an oddity given how much it borrows from Resident Evil 4, that I have to assume they started developing the game before Capcom decided to go ahead with an actual remake of 4. It does feel strange to get a spiritual successor and then an official remake of a game within such a short span of time, and I am curious to see how many assets from Village end up being carried over into the 4 remake.
Bad question, Hunnigan.
Which is ultimately why I feel that I didn't replay Village after my initial playthrough last year when it came out, despite the fact I definitely enjoyed my time with it, and this recent replay with the third person mode has been a bit of fun. I had hoped that maybe the so-called Mercenaries mode might keep me coming back to it, but after playing a few rounds of it, I knew it wasn't really going to keep me hooked for long, as it's more of an iteration on the Raid mode from the Revelation games than it is that classic Mercenaries from Resident Evil 4. And again, the actual mechanics of Village aren't quite as tailored towards frenetic action like Resident Evil 6 was, and that game had a fantastic version of Mercenaries.
Seriously? That's what you wanted to talk to me about?
The last addition added with the Winter's expansion is the new story campaign, Shadow of Rose, that sees you playing as Ethan's daughter Rose, and I really enjoyed this DLC a lot. The setup is that Rose is trying to find a way to cure herself of the abilities she has from the mold, and is told that she can find a purifying crystal if she enters into the consciousness of the Megamycete sample that holds the memories of everyone that was once a part of the Megamycete. That feels quite similar to the premise of The Evil Within now that I think of it, doesn't it?
This is very The Evil Within, if you think about this.
How do I even do this?
It then quickly becomes apparent to Rose that the laws of reality don't apply here, again, much like The Evil Within, as she has to survive her way through a nightmare world that wants to consume her.
This is very Evil Within, I love it, I love it, I love it.
Shadow of Rose does repurpose a lot of its locations from the main campaign, making it feel pretty familiar, but it does just enough with the way it subtly redesigns some of the artwork and creating new puzzles to make it feel like a fresh experience. For instance, the Duke is now one of the antagonists, and is kind of like a weird hybrid between John Wayne Gacy and the Joker, particularly with the way he taunts you over the intercoms like the Joker did in Arkham Asylum.
Shall we prolong our fun a little longer? Oh, come now, don't pout. I've prepared a nice little diversion for you. Anyone seen the big bad bat? I warn you, he may look like an idiot and talk like an idiot, but don't let that fool you. He really is an idiot.
Rose is clearly shown as being pretty proficient with firearms, which is a relief, but there is a bit more of a focus on stealth here. So it's Rose's powers that stand out most in the new gameplay loop, with her being able to destroy certain parts of the environment consumed by the mold to unlock new areas and resources. But it can also be used in combat as a way to stun enemies, which proves to be incredibly useful as this DLC does have a much stronger focus on survival horror than the main game, and I often found it was better to avoid enemies to save ammunition that I would need for later boss fights. Because this DLC utilizes nightmare logic in much the same way the Evil Within games did, there are quite a few pretty creative sequences throughout this campaign that were very surprising and felt quite different for a Resident Evil game. You do return to House Beneviento here that once again has some of the best puzzles of the game, and I'm just going to say that if you hate mannequins, then you may want to wear some brown pants because this sequence is pretty terrifying.
This guy's got the right idea. He wore the brown pants.
The actual story in Shadow of Rose is a little bit on the predictable side, and I won't spoil the ending here, but the twist revolving around Rose's mysterious helper I guessed almost immediately, and so did Markiplier, it would seem. With that said though, I was never not invested in Rose's plight because I found that she's actually one of the better written and more likable characters introduced into the franchise in quite some time. She reacts to many of the horrific things she sees in quite a natural way that you would expect from a teenage girl, yet still maintains a fun air of attitude to her, much in the same way as Heather from Silent Hill 3.
I got it, but just barely. This ugly brute turned up. No shit! I can't fight something like that.
I genuinely hope that this is not the last we see of her, as I would love to see her character expanded upon in future games and explore the true extent of her powers. Though this franchise does have a history of introducing new characters that are never seen again, so it would be a shame to waste the potential to take Rose in interesting directions in the future, especially as this does feel like the makings of a trilogy about the Winters family, with how 7 and Village have played out a bit more self-contained from the other games.
Guess there's no going back now.
Overall, returning to Resident Evil Village with the new Winters expansion pack has been a mostly enjoyable experience, and I would say it's definitely worth picking up for the Shadow of Rose campaign. In terms of where I'd place Village in my personal ranks in the series, I would say that I probably enjoy it more than Resident Evil 7, but it's also not a perfect game, which is why I've only replayed it twice. Resident Evil 4 and the remake of 2 are still the ones I think I'll replay before coming back to Village in the future, but that's just me, and my relationship with the franchise is a bit different from some of the more hardcore fans, as we'll see when I revisit Revelations 2. With that all said, however, thanks so much for watching me revisit Resident Evil Village, and if you like the content that I create, please consider supporting my Patreon to help out the channel. Until next time, stay safe out there everyone. Be wary of creepy castles that might be home to big mommy vampires, and I'll see you all in the next video.